Good morning, everyone. I'm going to briefly go over the types of environmental documents that the Turnpike typically prepares during the PD&E process. So this is going to be the non-major state actions and the state environmental impact reports. Now, Part 1, Chapter 10 of the PD&E manual, it provides guidance on the state, local, or privately funded project delivery process. And this process includes the preparation of the non-major state actions and the state environmental impact reports. And I know this is kind of hard to see, but this flow chart a visual representation of that process. And we're going to be starting here where the green arrow is for the purposes of this training, since we're going to be going over those state-funded projects only. We're not going to get into the local projects. So to determine whether a non-major state action or a state environmental impact report is prepared, the Turnpike is going to identify if the project qualifies for screening in the ETDM EST, and if screening is not required, the project's a non-major state action, and then a non-major state action checklist is prepared. But if the project does qualify for screening, then it's going to proceed through the ETDM process and then on to PD&E, where then a state environmental impact report is going to be prepared. And I know you guys have seen this list actually twice already today, but I'll go over it again. These are the types of projects that qualify for screening and are going to require a SEER. This list is also in both the PD&E and the ETDM manuals. And for roadway projects, these types of projects include those adding through lanes, which result in additional capacity on an existing road, constructing a new roadway, freeway, or expressway, constructing a highway that provides new access to an area, constructing or reconstructing or realigning an arterial highway, a new circumferential or belt highway that bypasses the community, addition of new interchanges or major interchange modifications to an existing freeway or expressway, and also constructing a bridge that provides a new access to an area or replacing a bridge. So as the lead agency for these types of projects, the Turnpike's responsibilities include preparing the environmental document, that's going to be your non-major state action or SEER, reviewing the project, and also the final step of approval. So first, we'll briefly go over those non-major state actions. And as mentioned earlier, these non-major state actions, or NMSAs, are FDOT-led projects that don't qualify for that ETDM screening, and therefore they don't require a PD&E study. Now, projects that are to proceed as these types of projects are identified during that statewide accelerated transformation process or SWAT process that Maria just went over. Now, they're going to require an environmental evaluation and completion of a non-major state action checklist. And this is completed using the statewide environmental project tracker called SWEPT. And they're typically prepared during the design phase. Now, this checklist documents the consideration of the environmental impacts, which are generally going to be minor for these projects. Remember, I was talking about significance earlier. These are the projects that are not significant or don't have substantial impacts. So environmental evaluations are required for all state-funded projects to comply with state and federal laws and FDOT policy. So they have to comply with a lot of the same laws that a federal project would. So even for a non-major state action, desktop analysis is done, and sometimes field analysis is necessary. And supporting documents or those technical reports may be needed to be prepared for some issues. There's also coordination with agencies that may be needed as well to make sure that there are no substantial impacts to the environmental resource. And there's guidance available on preparing the non-major state action checklist. And this is in part 1, chapter 10 of the PDE manual. And there's guidance in the text of the chapter. There's also a visual that is a form. And we are working on a CBT that should be available soon that kind of shows what all is involved in this process. Also, OEM's training webpage has a video that provides an overview of how the non-major state action is prepared and swept. And I believe Ruth is going to get to this also a little bit later in this training. So here's a sample non-major state action checklist for a completed project. And it's divided into 3 different sections. We've got general information, project description, and evaluation. Now, item number 1 includes your general information. This identifies the name of the project, the limits, the county, and the financial management members. And I believe a lot of this is automatically generated in SWEPT. Item 2 summarizes the project description. It's a brief description on the existing conditions, the purpose and need, the proposed improvements, such as things like the number of lanes, structures, median, and right-of-way. This third section is evaluation and provides a list of questions whose answers are then used to document the evaluation of those potential impacts of the project. During preparation, if any of these items are marked with yes, then it's going to need to be discussed and determined whether additional evaluation or a SEER is necessary. And consideration should be given to potential permitting requirement and needs at this point as well. And if all the answers are no, and the project is not considered a major transportation improvement, then the project is a non-major state action. And we're going to cover what a major transportation improvement is here soon. And information is also included here to substantiate the selection of yes or no. And guidance on determining impacts and responding to these questions is provided in different topic chapters in part 2 of the PDE manual. And some of them are referenced to the form itself. As you can see in this top here, we have a reference to the chapter here. And these chapters, along with the area of interest tool in the EST, and also the preparer's familiarity with the project area is what's used to complete the form. A brief summary of the evaluation may be included in the form itself or as an attachment, as you can see here. The questions cover topics ranging from impacts from things like traffic patterns and land use to sociocultural, natural, cultural, and physical resources. Now, this last one asks whether a public hearing is needed. Non-major state actions do not generally require a public hearing. Public involvement activities for these projects are conducted in accordance with Part 1, Chapter 11 of the PDE manual. And regardless of the type of the project, Section 339.1555B of the Florida statutes, it requires a public hearing for those major transportation improvements. Okay, so those are listed as projects that are increasing capacity through the addition of new lanes, providing new access to a limited or controlled access facility, such as new interchanges, and 3, construction of a facility in a new location. So these are considered those major transportation improvement projects as defined in the statute. And at the end of this form, there's a statement that's included stating that the project is not a major transportation improvement project, and based on the evaluation, it's been determined to be a non-major state action. And then the Turnpike Environmental Administrator or designee then electronically signs and dates this form in SWEP. It also includes a list of attachments at the end of the form with links to the supplemental information such as figures, graphs, and summaries of the evaluation itself. So after signing the checklist, the environmental certification for state-funded project form is prepared and SWEP. The environmental manager's signature on this form certifies that the environmental analysis has been completed, and it provides environmental clearance to continue through the project delivery process. This form is also done in reevaluations, and we're going to go over this a little bit more when I go over reevaluations tomorrow. So if a non-major state action checklist was previously completed, and say it's completed at a later phase, it needs to be looked at again, it's evaluated, and by updating the checklist. And then after signing the checklist, a new environmental certification form is prepared. Okay, so now let's move on to the State Environmental Impact Report, or SEERs. Now remember, the SEERs are prepared for those FDOT-led state-funded projects that require a PDE study. So for most projects, again, this was identified during that SWOT process. And the size and the level of detail that's needed to support the decision can vary in a SEER, and it's all really going to depend on the project-specific circumstances. The State Environmental Impact Report form is used to document SEER projects, and currently this form is available from FDOT's Policy and Process Management Unit website. I'll have a link for that later, but soon it's going to be incorporated into SWEP to be completed electronically. Now, during the PD&E phase, the engineering and the environmental analysis is conducted to assess project impact. And this typically includes consultation with resource agencies and the completion of those technical reports that Maria told us about earlier today. The amount of analysis that's needed is going to depend on the potential for the environmental impact and if those impacts will be significant or substantial in this case. The engineering analysis is conducted according to Part 2, Chapter 3 of the PD&E manual, and it's documented in a preliminary engineering report. Now, this report is then referenced in the SEER, and Maria will be going over this later this afternoon. Now, for SEERs, there's no requirement to evaluate multiple build alternatives. It's going to depend on the project-specific considerations. So it is possible to only have one build alternative in addition to the no action. The level of the environmental analysis that's needed is going to differ on a project-by-project basis. This the level of analysis should be sufficient to adequately identify the impacts, and it should address comments that were provided early on in the process. Maybe some comments were made by the ETAT that certain studies and things needed to be made. This document should address those. Also, comments maybe from other agencies, parties, or the public during the ETDM screening or the advance notification. Now, the analysis should facilitate coordination with agencies and stakeholders and address opportunities and approaches to mitigation when needed, and provide sufficient detail to support conclusions and scientific and analytical basis for the comparison of alternatives if applicable. So unlike the engineering analysis, this is summarized and documented in the SEER itself with references to supporting technical reports that detail the analysis. Chapters in Part 2 of the PD&E manual, they detail how to conduct the engineering and environmental analysis. They provide guidance on coordination with the agencies and organizations, and also they give specifics on what should be included in the SEER dependent on the level of impacts. Several of these PDE manual chapters in Part 2 also have NEPA introductory courses, and most of these are included are available as webinars, and they're available on OEM's training page. There is guidance available on preparing a SEER form in Part 1, Chapter 10 of the PDE manual. And just like with this non-major state action, there's guidance in the text, and then there's a visual of the form as a figure in the end of the chapter, and we're working on that computer-based training to come out soon. Okay, so here's the completed SEER form that we're going to go through to introduce you to each section. The project description and purpose and need section of the form includes your project information, a description of the proposed improvements, and the project's purpose and need. And we just learned about that purpose and need just a few minutes ago. And the information is developed early in the planning process, and it's reassessed during the PDE study. And for the detailed guidance on purpose and need is in Part 2, Chapter 1 of the PDE manual. Planning consistency information is also documented in the SEER. This information is included to reflect that the project is appropriately described and cost estimates in state and local plans are consistent. And this is a tool that is used to assist in the timely advancement of project funds and future phases of the project. The status of funding for future phases of the project should be included in this table, which is provided in the form. This planning consistency information is helpful to make sure that the project is in good standing. For future phases not currently shown on reference plans and programs, the form should also include information on the planned steps towards implementation, including the anticipated fiscal years. Supporting documentation for project plan consistency should also be attached to the form, such as actual pages from the appropriate long-range transportation plan, the cost feasible plan, transportation improvement program, and the current state transportation improvement program. And we have a lot more information available on planning consistency in both Part 1, Chapter 4 and Part 2, Chapter 1 of the PDE manual, as well as this guidance document, the guidance for meeting planning requirements for NEPA approval. And I'll include a link to these resources here at the end of this presentation. The environmental analysis section of the form documents the results of the environmental analysis that was just discussed. The appropriate level of impact is going to be identified here as substantial, not substantial, an enhancement, or no involvement. And this is selected for each issue or resource, and supporting information is included as an attachment and referenced here under supporting information. Environmental issues or resources with no involvement do not need a lot of supporting documentation. Now, the documentation for each of these issues or resources listed here is based on the results of the analysis. Also, the knowledge of the project area and the input from the agencies and the public and input throughout the whole scoping process. So the supporting information for each of these resources should describe the existing conditions of the project area. They should identify that potential degree of impact of the alternatives, including the enhancements, not only due to the alignment, but also for areas within the project area, maybe those proposed drainage structure or stormwater ponds. There should be charts, tables, maps, and other graphics that illustrate the comparison between alternatives. There's also are some standard statements that are available for specific resources that may be used if there's no impact. And these are all available in these individual Part 2 chapters. And these are those environmental issues or resources and their accompanying chapters in Part 2 of the PDE manual. And they fall under the categories of social and economic, cultural, natural, and physical. And we're going to discuss most of these in more detail throughout this training. Now, the State Environmental Impact Report form includes a section on anticipated permits. This section lists the permit needs identified in the PDE study, and it includes their status. Documentation of coordination with permitting agencies also is included in the project file, and guidance on the permit types and preparing this section is found in Part 1, Chapter 12 of the PDE manual. And Clark's going to discuss this in more detail tomorrow. The engineering analysis section typically states that the engineering analysis is contained in a preliminary engineering report. Now, Part 2, Chapter 3 of the PDE manual provides guidance on conducting the engineering analysis for PDE studies and also the preparation of this report. And Maria will be going over this, I believe, later today. The form also includes a section on FDOT commitments, and these are commitments made to others, such as agencies or local governments, and they're made in order to typically advance the project. So as you can see on this project, this section catalogs and discusses all the commitments made on the project prior to and during the PDE phase. Commitments should be documented according to FDOT's project commitment tracking procedure, and guidance on appropriate commitments and preparing them, and also how to prepare this section of the form is found in Part 2, Chapter 22 of the PDE manual. And we do have a computer-based NEPA introductory course on commitments available as well for more information. Now, the FDOT selected alternative section discusses the selected alternative based on the engineering and environmental analysis. And then there is a place for approved public availability. This confirms that the document has gone through a quality assurance, quality control review. And this is selected before the project has a public hearing, if a public hearing is required. So this section also includes a line for the signature of the Environmental Management Office Manager and the date that the project was accepted for public review. The public involvement section documents if a public hearing was required. Remember, I talked about those requirements for when you need to do a public hearing. It also will document the status of holding a public hearing, whether it's been held or is going to be held. And for a project which does not require a public hearing, an opportunity for a public hearing may still be provided and documented here. The public involvement process is outlined in Part 1, Chapter 11 of the PDE manual and is followed when preparing a SEER. And Rusty Ennemoser will be discussing this process tomorrow. The approval of final document section is going to include a non-discrimination standard statement as shown here, and the signature block for Turnpike approval of the SEER. And this particular SEER was approved by the Turnpike Executive Director and Chief Executive Officer. Documents referenced in the supporting information section of the form are included as attachments. And these may include those coordination letters, memos, maps, and the summaries of the environmental analysis. And the project file is maintained and swept and should contain the analytical documentation to support the project decisions. So technical reports, technical memorandums, and other large studies are considered technical materials, and they're not really attached to the SEER. Instead, they are referenced and they're uploaded to this project file. Part 1, Chapter 15 of the PDE manual discusses this in more detail, and Pete is going to be covering this here pretty soon. Now, after approval, the SEER form's uploaded into SWEPT currently. Then, as I mentioned earlier, it's soon going to be prepared in SWEPT. And the Turnpike circulates the SEER to those relevant resource agencies and the offices responsible for the next phase of the project. The environmental office will also complete and provide the date of approval on the environmental certification for state-funded project form in SWEPT. And again, we're going to discuss this process with reevaluations. I've included a list of the resources that were mentioned in this session, so you guys have access to them later if you'd like more information. And I don't know if we have time for any questions. I'd be glad to help answer any of those.
Yeah, we have a few that came in that didn't get answered, but a couple of them are for a non-major state action, you can have a yes checked, but it can still be a non-major state action with additional evaluation. Is that correct?
Let me go back up and look. Okay, so if it is a yes, okay. This here requires coordination. So if there is a yes, then there needs to be a little bit more coordination on whether the project should stay as a non-major state action or if it needs to instead be a SEER. And yes, it can stay a non-major state action, and it might just require a little extra analysis and coordination and documentation of to why it remains a not substantial impact. And I hope that answered that well enough. Are there any other questions? Or does anybody have any more input on that?
Christine, there is another question that you might be able to address. Does substantial impact have a cost threshold?
I don't believe so. There's not any that I'm aware of, and we can definitely look more into that.